Awesome. So today we are going through preprocessing 1. So you've probably spent the morning installing Node and less watch compiler. If you are having environment issues, so you are unable to get these installations up and running, don't worry, we will jump into Zooms with you just like we did with GitHub. So if you're having any issues with that, please post them in the help channel. Keep Slido for more of the concepts that we're going to be going over in the guided project. You don't need these things installed to follow along with the guided project. So if you're freaking out about that, please don't worry. We will get you up and running by the end of the day. Okay, so I'm going to pull up this site here. So this is NPM, and what is NPM? It's just a package. A package is a small portion of JavaScript. It's a library. It does one thing, and it does it really, really well. So you spent the morning installing packages, so you probably felt some of this pain. So specifically, you had to install less and less watch compiler. So let's just look up less watch compiler for a moment. Okay, and it says dead, simple, less CSS watch compiler. You may not agree right now with this dead simple part, but I promise that it will get easier the more you use it. So basically what this does is it watches our code, so we don't have to continue to save and run a command over and over and over again. This is going to make a little bit more sense closer to the end of the guided project. I'll go into some more detail on how this works. You might have installed NPM or Yarn, either one. They're pretty much the same under the hood, so whichever one works for you, I would stick with that one. We recommend NPM just because you're going to be using it later on in the course, but if you've installed Yarn and you got all of this up and running with Yarn, they're both just package managers, so they're both doing the same thing underneath the hood. Okay, I'm going to open up CodePen, and we're going to talk about some of these tools. So we don't need to install anything on CodePen. It's already installed for us. So I don't want you to think that any of this is magic. It's just that CodePen has already installed this stuff on their server. So let's open up the preprocessor on CodePen together. We're going to go to Settings. We're going to click on CSS. And it says CSS preprocessor. So if we click that list, we've got like the 5 big ones, and we are going to select less. So some of you might be thinking, why are we learning less? I heard that SAS was industry standard. I'm telling you that if you've learned one preprocessor, you've learned them all. The only thing that's different between less and the other big preprocessors is syntax. So the ideas, the concepts, they translate to all of them. The syntax might vary a little bit, but if you learn one, you can easily pick up any of the others. So we're going to save and close. And now it says CSS and less in brackets. Okay, and if we go through this site, we can see that we have our semantic HTML, we've got our CSS. If we move this over, we can see that it's responsive. So nothing different there. This is all stuff that we've been learning so far. So you're probably thinking, what are we going to do with all of this stuff that we've already learned? We are going to enhance this stuff using a CSS preprocessor. So before we go any further, let's talk about what a preprocessor is. It has 3 parts, and I'm going to write some notes for you. Okay, so it has less, which is the syntax. So first is the syntactical piece, and we are going to be writing in less. Okay. And then we have a compiler. So that's number 2, compiler. And our compiler is Node. Node is going to be the compiler of our less. And then 3, we have our outputted CSS. Okay, and that's pretty much the life cycle of every preprocessor. So you will never write vanilla CSS again, vanilla CSS is like plain ordinary CSS. Now we're always going to use a preprocessor to write our CSS, and then we're going to compile it into our .css file. So the browser reads vanilla CSS. We get to do all of these cool things using a preprocessor, and then our compiler converts it back into regular CSS so that the browser can read it, and that's what goes up on our site. Okay, so think of the compiler as kind of like a translator. It translates all of the less you write back into CSS. Okay, so some of you are probably thinking, well, you said the syntax is different, and I'm scrolling through this CSS syntax, or this less syntax, and it looks like plain old CSS to me. So you're not wrong. So you can write CSS, just plain CSS, in less. What's different is that you can't write less syntax in CSS. And we'll get into what that looks like. So I'm going to save those notes. Okay, so the first concept I want to get into here is the concept of nesting. And who remembers what nesting is? So thread, what is nesting? When I say something is nested, what am I talking about? Yeah, a parent-child relationship. Sure, it's inside, an element inside of another element. Yeah, exactly. So things that are inside of other things. So if we look at the way our HTML is laid out, we take a look at the header. We can see that inside the header, we have an H1 nested, we have a navigation nested, and then nested inside of the navigation, we have a bunch of A tags. So wouldn't it make sense if we could do that in CSS, right? All of our HTML is nested. Why can't we just nest it in CSS? Well, with less, you can. And I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like. So we've got a header. I'm going to write a comment here. This closes the header, just so we don't get lost in our curly brackets. Notice my comments look a little bit different as well. What type of comments are these? The double slash, what kind of comments are those? Has anybody seen those before? Yeah, JavaScript comments, perfect. Okay, so we can actually write JavaScript comments in less. Okay, so inside the header, we have our H1. So I'm gonna take this H1, I'm gonna cut it and paste it inside the header. Now I can get rid of the word header because it's redundant. And now my H1 is nested inside of my header. So this closes the H1, just like in HTML. And I can highlight this and hit Shift-Tab to fix that spacing. Okay, this line here, this empty line, we don't need it. We could bring the H1 and put it up here. But I like to just add that empty line there just to make things easier to read. But if you want to get rid of that empty line, you can totally do that. Spacing doesn't matter so much in less or CSS. All right, the next opportunity I have to nest something here is this navigation inside of my header. So again, I'm gonna cut that navigation. I'm gonna put it inside of my header. And I'm gonna say this closes the nav. I can get rid of this word header, whoops, because now it's nested in my header, so I no longer need it. And I'm gonna highlight this again and hit Shift-Tab to fix the spacing. Okay, the next thing I can nest is that I have A links inside of my nav, inside of my header. So let's go ahead and grab those A links. And I want to nest those inside of my navigation. Okay, this closes my A tags. I can get rid of header and nav because now it's nested inside of the nav and nested inside of the header. So that's kind of redundant. I can highlight this and hit Shift Tab to fix that spacing. Okay, next, I can take this first anchor class inside of the nav, inside of the header, and nest that as well. So I want to make sure that I'm inside of my nav. I can get rid of header and nav, and I can Shift Tab to fix the spacing and nest that class right there. So this closes first anchor. Save. All right, so everything's still working here. Now these things are nested inside of my header. Okay, another thing that I can nest is these media queries here. So we talked about how media queries are written a little bit differently in Less. So in vanilla CSS, we wrote all of our media queries probably at the bottom of our code. In Less, we write our media queries individually for each thing. So for the header, we write its own individual media query. There's some benefits to this. So if I take this and I put it inside of my header, okay, now I can get rid of header, and I can get rid of this extra curly bracket because it's nested inside. But now when I go and look at my header, all of the styles for my header, no matter what screen size I'm looking at, are right here in front of me. So I don't need to scroll around through a bunch of lines of code to try and find a style for my header at a certain screen size. They're all right here in front of me. So this closes the media query for the header. And you're gonna wanna write these notes just to keep yourself organized. Otherwise, you're gonna miss some curly brackets. Okay, so let's go ahead and nest the rest of these media queries for the header section. So I'm gonna take this H1 media query and I'm gonna put it inside of the H1. Okay, again, I can get rid of H1 or header H1 because now that's redundant, and I can get rid of that extra curly bracket. And I'll write a comment here. This closes the media query for the H1. Okay, this closes the H1. Okay, and we also have a media query for the nav. So let's just go ahead and take that and nest it inside of the navigation. I can get rid of this extra line of code that says header nav. Now it's nested inside of there, so that's redundant. We've got an extra closing curly bracket that we can get rid of too. This closes the media query for the nav. Okay, Shift Tab to fix the spacing. Okay, so we've just saved ourselves a bunch of space by nesting these things. And now when we're looking for our styles for our header, they're all nested within the header. So before I let you try this, just a couple of rules. So nesting in Less, kind of like Inception, you don't want to go more than 3, maybe 4 levels deep. So things like HTML, I would never nest anything inside of there. Things like my general styles, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, etc. I probably wouldn't try and nest these. I would never nest the body. Container wraps around the entire site, so I probably wouldn't nest anything inside of there. The only thing I'm really worried about nesting is the different sections. So I would probably just go section by section and nest that way. So you don't want to get too deep in your nesting, otherwise things will start to break and get more and more confusing. So I'd like you to try this on your own. I want you to go through the rest of the site and spend some time nesting it. So you can nest some things probably inside of the main content, the footer, and then the button can probably be nested as well. So let me put you into your breakout rooms. And make sure that in your breakout rooms, you are sharing screens with each other. So one person just quickly decide to share the screen. You probably want to be the person that shares the screen because then you don't have to do the talking or the thinking. Everyone's telling you what to type. And then the rest of the group, you're going to work together and nest the rest of this site. So I'm going to open those breakout rooms, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes, and then we're going to take it up. All right, so I want to see everybody in their breakout rooms. Remember that this does count for attendance. If you are not participating in your breakout room right now, you will be marked as absent. All right, if you're back in the main channel, let me know how that breakout went for you. Were you able to get some nesting done? And if you didn't get the whole site nested, no worries, we are going to do it together. So if you're a little confused about a certain section, that is totally fine. All right, we've got about half the class back. So just let me know in that thread how the breakout went for you. Were you able to get part of the site nested? Were you able to get the whole thing done? Was there anything that was confusing about this breakout? All right, it looks like everyone is back. So let's do this together. If you didn't get a chance, go ahead and respond to that thread and let me know how the breakout went for your group. Let's do this together. Oops. Turn that timer off. There we go. Okay, so we don't want to go more than 3-4 levels deep at the most with our nesting. So I would just pay attention to the sections. And we've got main content, which if we take a look at the HTML, main content starts here. It's a div that wraps around 2 sections. So you can probably nest the things that are inside of main content inside of it. So let's see where our first opportunity is here. We've got this main content section. Let's go ahead and take that and put it inside of main content. We can get rid of main content. We can leave section. So we'll say this closes main content. This closes the section inside of main content. Okay, any section inside of main content. We'll say Shift Tab to fix the spacing. And then we've got 2 media queries here. So we've got one for the class of main content and one for the section inside of the class of main content. So let's nest those things as well. We'll grab the first media query. It goes right inside of main content. So we'll just give ourselves some space here, add that media query there. So now we can get rid of main content inside of the media query because it's nested inside of main content. So that is redundant. We'll get rid of that extra closing curly bracket. And here we'll say this closes the main content media query. Okay, I like to add some space there. We can highlight this and hit Shift Tab to fix our spacing. Next, we want to grab the media query for the section. Okay, that has to be nested inside of the section. So pay attention to your comments here. This closes the section inside of main content. That is where we want to put that media query. Now we can get rid of main content section because it's nested inside of there already. We can get rid of this extra closing curly bracket. This closes the media query for the section inside of main content. Okay, I'm going to highlight all of this and hit Shift Tab to fix the spacing. Okay, next, I would say we have our footer. And if we go and take a look here at the footer, we can see that we have a navigation nested inside of the footer and some A-links nested inside of the nav. So let's take that nav and put it inside of the footer. So we'll take this. We'll say this closes the footer. This closes the nav inside of the footer. And now we can get rid of this main footer class because that nav is nested inside of the main footer. So we already know that it's the nav inside of the main footer. Okay, we can hit Shift Tab to fix the spacing. I'm going to save this so far just in case you need to give that link a refresh. Okay, finally we have this book a flight button. And we have a media query for 2 different screen sizes for the book a flight button. So let's go ahead and nest those media queries. So first we'll say this closes the book flight button. Okay, we'll grab this first media query and put it inside of there. Okay, once again, we can get rid of this extra curly bracket. We can get rid of book a flight button because it's already nested inside of here. and we can say this closes the 515 pixel media query. Okay, and then we have a media query for 400 pixels as well. So let's grab that media query. It's got to be outside of this closing curly bracket because we're not nesting the media query inside of the media query. So that is a point of confusion for some people. So I just want to make that really clear. This is its own media query. So it is not nested inside of the media query for 515 pixels. Okay, they're two separate media queries. They're both nested inside of the book a flight button, but they're separate. So this curly bracket needs to close before this media query starts. Okay, so we can get rid of book a flight button. We can get rid of the extra curly bracket. And we can say this closes the 400 pixel media query. Okay, save. We move our site over. It's still responsive. Everything's still working. So we're good. So we've just nested our first site. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to give you a 5-minute break. If you have any questions about what we've done so far, get those questions into Slido. I'll answer those questions after the break, and then we're going to move on to our next concept. See you in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back, Web31. Let's answer some questions. Kevin asks, how do you hover while you're nested, or is that going too deep? Great question. Let's do this together so you can see an example. It's not going too deep. I would definitely nest a hover. That is a great thing to nest. So if we wanted to add a hover to the links on our navigation, we could nest inside of those links, and the syntax for hovering in less is &:hover. Okay, so we can say this closes the hover, and we can say something like color orange. Okay, so now those links change orange when we hover. So hover is definitely something I would nest, and just make sure you pay attention to the way you write a hover. Unless it is that &:hover when it's nested. Okay. So if I were to convert this back to CSS, so after it gets compiled, it goes back to CSS. So if you uncompiled less, or sorry, if you compiled CSS, you can scroll down and you can see that everything has been unnested. And you can see that that &hover is written as header nav a::hover. Okay, so this is just letting us write CSS in a more efficient way, but your browser is still reading this vanilla CSS, which is why we're using that compiler. We get to write fancy rules, and then the compiler converts it back into plain old CSS. Okay, so we're going to click on View Uncompiled Less, and we can go back to working in our less document. All right, next question. Is there a max amount of nesting you'd recommend, or just 2 or 3 deep? I would say no more than 3 or 4 levels deep, and I can answer, is there a specific reason why we don't want to go more than 3 or 4 levels deep? I'll answer that at the same time. It just gets really confusing. So you start to lose your curly brackets, things start to break, you start to not know where you should be writing specific rules, things get nested inside of things that they shouldn't really be nested inside. So just for your own sanity, I wouldn't go more than 3 or 4 levels deep, because that's where things start to break and get confusing. If you want to try it, be my guest, but you may lose some hair if you do it that way. So just as a general rule of thumb, I wouldn't nest more than 3 or 4 levels deep. Okay, let's move on to our next topic. So the next thing we're going to learn about is variables in less. And I would like you all to pull up the less documentation. We're going to read some documentation because we're learning something new. So I'll share that in the channel. And before we get started, what is a variable? Who knows what a variable is? They exist in many programming languages. Give me a shot at explaining it in your own words. Just 2 replies. Any other guesses before we talk about this? Yeah, it holds information. It stores information. I like to think of a variable as a jar. I can put a piece of information inside of it. I can label it. I can put it up on the shelf, and then I can call it back down whenever I need to retrieve that piece of information. Okay, and variables is something we're going to be working with in JavaScript as well. So these are concepts that you're going to keep working with as you progress in your career and your learning. Okay, let's take a look at what a variable looks like. And it's right here. So we give the variable a name, we say @, and then we call it something. And then we store a value inside of it. So width is probably not something I would create a variable for. Variables are really good for things that are used throughout the site in multiple different places. So things like colors, for example. So I can store a color in a variable. So I can say something like @main color, and I can go and grab that yellow color from the Book a Flight button. Okay, and I can store that in my variable. And now I don't have to remember this hex code. Whenever I need that yellow color, I can just call main color. So for example, the links in the navigation, I could change them to that main color by saying color at main color. Okay, so now they've changed yellow. If I want to do that for the links in the nav as well, I can say color at main color. Okay, and I'm actually just going to update this hex code with main color. We need the links inside of the nav, so we've got to write a rule for that actually. So we're inside of the nav, we can say a color at main color. Okay, so we save. So you're probably thinking, okay, why is this useful? Well, say you're working with a client and they've decided that this main color is going to be the color for everything on their site. So you've gone and you've created their 50-page website with thousands and thousands of lines of code, and then they come back to you in the revisions and they say, actually, I hate the color yellow. I think I want to change everything to sky blue. Okay, so now you've got to hit Control F and you've got to take this hex code and you've got to look through thousands and thousands of lines of code and change and update that color everywhere. If the color is stored in a variable, all you have to do is come here and say sky blue. It's updated in one place, and then it just automatically updates your variable everywhere that it's found. Okay, so you're changing one line of code rather than changing 500 lines of code, potentially. Another really great thing to store in a variable is fonts. So I'm going to get you to watch me do this, and then I'm going to give you a chance to try it. So we'll go back to Google Fonts. Okay, let's pick a font that we want to use. So I'm going to pick this one here, and I'm going to add it. Okay, I'm going to embed it in my site. So I'll just use this import rule. It's just as easy as using the link tag. Either one works. Put this at the top of my CSS style sheet where I call in my font, and then I'm going to create a variable for it at main font. And in that variable, I am storing the value, not the selector. So I'm not storing font family, I'm storing whatever would be inside of font family. And in this case, it's this font stack here. So a font stack is basically like a fallback for your font. It's saying if for some reason Roboto doesn't load, just load a sans serif font. Okay, this was much more popular when web fonts were not a thing, because before web fonts existed, if a user didn't have a font installed on their computer, they wouldn't see that font on their website. So it was saying, like, if the user doesn't have Roboto installed, then just display a sans serif. Now that we have web fonts, if the person is using the internet to view this website, then this font is being called in and they're able to see it. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And then if I wanted to make this font the main font of my website, I could select my body and I could say font family and then at main font. Okay, so what you're storing in the variable is the second half of your key value pair. You're storing the value, not the key. I'm going to save that. And my font is now changed. Okay, so I'm going to give you a chance to try this in your breakout rooms, and I'll give you enough time to do this. I would like you to make a variable for 2 fonts. So one for the body and one for the heading. Assign these variables to a font family and call them in your heading and your body. So there's the instructions for you. So you're selecting 2 fonts, you're calling in both of those fonts, you're storing a main font and a font for your headings, and then you're using those variable names to call them in. So let me open up those breakout rooms again. Okay, and I'm gonna put another 5 minutes on the clock. Go ahead over to Google Fonts, pick your fonts, store them in your variables. All right, just a reminder here that we do want to see everybody in these breakout rooms. If you are still in the main room, you are going to be marked absent. So please make sure that you're joining those breakout rooms. All right, I'm seeing lots of people back in the main room. I'm assuming that that's a good sign. Let me know how your breakout went if you are back. Just gonna give everybody else a couple more seconds to finish before I call them back. Okay, I'm calling everyone else back now, so it'll just be another minute before everybody gets back in here. If you are just getting back, let me know how that breakout went for your team. Were you able to store 2 fonts in different variables and call them in where you needed them? All right, we're still missing about half the class. So just give them another few moments to get back and then we'll take it up together. Okay, it looks like everyone's back. So let's take this up together. If your group didn't get it, no worries, we can do this all together. So I've selected one family. Now I'm gonna select another family. So I also want, I don't know, we'll say this one for my titles. Oh, it looks like that's the same one. It's just a bold version of it. So let me grab a different one. One that looks different so we can see the change. We'll take this one. Okay. So I want to add this for my titles. So I'm going to grab this import rule here. So embed. I'm going to take this. I'm just going to update the one I currently have. Okay. My first font I stored in a variable already. My second font I'm going to store in a different variable. So I'll take this font family and store it in a variable called heading font. Oops. Okay, save. And then I've actually got to call this font into my headings. So I can say font family at heading font. Okay, and now my headings are different than the rest of the font on my page. I've got Open Sans for my headings and Roboto for my body. Okay, I'm gonna stop here and see if there's any questions so far. So the main thing with variables is that you are storing values that are used throughout your website so that you can update them in one place. Okay. These also get consumed by the compiler. So if we were to view the compiled CSS, we can see that our variables have disappeared and the actual value that we've stored in that variable is now in place of where we've called the variable in. Okay, even here, we can see that the color is updated to sky blue. It's no longer that variable. Okay, so it's a jar that we can put a value in and then we can update or retrieve that value as needed. So I'm gonna go back to the uncompiled less. Let's see if we have some questions here. All right, Bryce asks, how is our main font automatically associated with our import URL? So good question, it's not automatically associated. So we had to do a couple of different steps here. So this import URL, this calls the fonts in. So what this rule does is it basically says, hey browser, you've actually got to call these fonts in order to read this style sheet. So when you load this style sheet, you need to load these fonts as well. Okay, and then we've taken those individual fonts and we've told them which variable to be associated with. So in main font, we've come in and we've stored this first font in that variable. And then we've gone into our CSS and we've actually told that variable where it should be applied. Okay, so there's 3 steps there. Nothing was automatic. We've explicitly told CSS these instructions at every single step. So instruction number 1 was when you load this style sheet, you must also load these fonts. Step 2 was main font is going to equal this specific font that I've told you to be. And step 3 was I am applying the main font here in this font family. Okay, so I hope that makes a little more sense now. Any difference with speed security between importing fonts to our HTML versus our CSS? Nope, no difference. And you shouldn't really have any security issues with fonts. But the speed is the same whether you use the link or the import. It shouldn't matter. How many things should we import for our style sheets? Good question, Carmen. So you wouldn't really be importing very much. You might import fonts, and as a general design rule, you should try to mix two fonts, but never use more than 3 fonts. Otherwise, things really start to look messy. So I would say like 3 fonts should be the max that you're loading ever. But generally, you'll mix 2. And the speed, the load speed shouldn't really be that affected if you're only using 2 to 3 fonts. If you use 50 fonts, then yeah, it might take a while for your web page to load, but your web page is also going to be probably pretty ugly, so you might want to reassess as to which fonts you actually need in there. What is a good naming convention for variables? Yeah, really good question. So you can use dashes. I believe you can use underscores in variable names. Let me just try to, let me not do it in main color because it's in too many places, but let's try main font. Main font. Yeah, you can use underscores, or you could camel case, meaning you make the first letter of each word capital. So main font, like that. One is not necessarily more right than the other. I would just say stick to one and be consistent. So stick to one naming convention and just be consistent. You can't use spaces. You can't use special characters in naming variables. Tomorrow, we're also going to talk about reserved keywords. So you can't use any words that CSS has already reserved. So for example, I couldn't store something in @media because @media is already a keyword that CSS uses. But we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. If we want to store our media queries, we're actually doing something called escaping, and the syntax is just slightly different. But that is an objective for tomorrow. So we'll get to that tomorrow. For today, just worry about your fonts and your colors and storing those in variables. But yeah, really good question. Do you usually have 2 imports for heading and main, or do you use a stack that has 2 fonts? So you could do it either way, John. If you think that your client or your client, I guess, is going to change their mind 5 million times about which font they want to use for their heading and their body, you might just want to import them separately so that it's easier to change. But it doesn't really matter. You could import them together as well. So really that's your preference. You could import the fonts separately or together, whatever you prefer. Just make sure that you're importing the correct fonts and then calling those fonts in appropriately. All right, we are another half an hour in. I know time flies when you're having fun. Go and take another break, and then we're going to talk about our last topic for today. All right, welcome back, Web31. Let's just see if there's any more questions. Bryce asks, in the case of adding images alongside with fonts, would you place all of the imports at the top of your code space? So you're actually not importing images. So this wouldn't really apply there. Ideally, you'd be saving your images in an images folder, and you're either calling them in HTML or you're putting them in as a background image in CSS. Either way, you're giving a file path to the folder that you're saving the images in. But we don't use an @import rule to import images. So just fonts. All right, let's talk about our last topic today so that we can spend some time talking about the project as well. And the last thing I want to talk to you about today is something called mix-ins. So let's go back to our documentation because it's something new that we're learning. And we can take a look at mix-ins. So mix-ins are kind of like fancy classes. Okay, notice that we name them like a class. When we call them, we need parentheses. Okay, so these smooth brackets. You also want to include these smooth brackets when you're creating a mix-in, even though you don't have to. And the reason for that is because we want the mix-in to be consumed by the compiler. We don't want it to stay on top of your CSS as this random class that is not actually used anywhere. Okay, so with a mix-in, we're basically writing snippets of reusable code that we can call in different places of our CSS. And let's see an example of this together. So right now, our button is not centered. I'm going to create a mix-in that would center something that we could call in whenever we wanted to center something. So I'm going to say dot center and some smooth brackets, and then I'm going to open and close some curly brackets. So I would say something like display flex, justify content, center, align items, center. And then I could apply this to things that I want to center. So if I want to center this button, take a look at the HTML and tell me what is the first thing I need to do. The first thing I need to do to center the button. So can I just call center on the button, or do I need to do something first? Yep, so the center mix-in is already saying display flex, but what can I apply this to? Can I just apply this right to the button if I want the button to be centered? Yeah, Manuel's onto something. So remember that Flexbox has to go on the parent, right? Display flex has to go on the parent. Right now, the button doesn't have a parent. If we put this class right on the button, nothing's going to happen because the button also has no children. So we need to say something like div button parent. Okay, and we need to wrap a div around this button. Okay, I can hit Shift Tab to fix the spacing. So step 1, we're going to wrap a div around the button. Step 2, we're going to call that div. So we can say something like dot button parent. And then we can call in that class or that mix-in of centered. Okay, and then now our button is centered. So pretty useful. Now, whenever I needed to center something with Flexbox, I could just call center on the parent. I wouldn't have to rewrite display flex, justify content center, align item center. I'm saving myself 3 lines of code every time I need to use this center mix-in. Okay. Before I let you try it, I just want to talk about these parentheses. So this center mix-in works without the parentheses when I'm defining it. I always need the parentheses or those smooth brackets when I'm applying it, so when I'm calling it in. But we want those smooth brackets when we are defining it, and I will show you why. So if I view the compiled CSS, notice that without those smooth brackets, this mix-in doesn't get consumed by the compiler. It stays on top of our CSS as this random class that is never actually used anywhere. So we have no class of center in our HTML. Okay, if we go and we scroll down to our button parent right here, we can see that center is changed to display flex, justify content center, align item center, but still this random class stays on top of our CSS. I'm going to go back to the uncompiled less. If I use those parentheses when, oops, not container. Where's my center class? There we go. If I use these parentheses when I am defining my mix-in, and then I view the compiled CSS, notice that it's disappeared. Okay, it's been consumed by the compiler. There's no random class that is never used anywhere sitting at the top of my CSS. Okay, so that's what I want. I want it to be consumed by the compiler because I don't want unused code sitting in my CSS file. Okay, so we want those parentheses. So I just want to make that distinction clear. Okay, so view uncompiled less. So I've got a challenge for you. Of course, you get to try it. So I would like you to create a mix-in for a border and put this border around your paragraphs. So there you go. Let me put you back into your breakout rooms. Okay, I'm going to put 5 more minutes on the clock. That should be enough time to create a bordered mix-in and call it in. I'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, lots of people back in the main channel. How did that breakout go? I'm assuming it went well. I'm just going to give everybody else a few more seconds here before I call them back. Okay, I'll call everyone else back. If you're back in the main room already, go ahead and let me know how that breakout went on the thread in the main channel, just while we wait for everybody else to get back. All right, there's about 46 of you back in the main room, so I want to see either 46 replies or 46 emojis on that thread. Let me know how that breakout went for you. We're just waiting until everybody gets back and then we'll take it up. Okay, looks like everyone's back. Let's take this up together. Okay, so our instructions were to make a mix-in for a border and add it around our paragraphs. So let's do that. We can say bordered. Remember, we want those parentheses. We're going to open and close some curly brackets. So border takes 3 properties. Doesn't really matter what order you put them in. It takes a size, so let's say 3 pixels. It takes a border style. If you type in css.cool and you go to border styles, you can see all of them here. Solid, I would say, is probably the most common one. You've got some pretty like 90s retro ones here. So you can choose what style you want. So let's say dotted. And then the third property is a color. So I'm just gonna choose an accent color here. We'll say dark orange can be our accent color. Okay, and let's just store that in a variable. Before we call it in. So here I can say at accent color. Okay, so we've got that. We can add another rule. So I'm going to add padding of 2% as well, just to push our border away from our paragraph a little bit. Save. Okay, now we have to call this into our paragraphs. So we find the rule for our paragraphs, and we just come down here and say bordered. And our rule gets automatically applied there. Okay, if I wanted to put that around my image as well, I can just call it in here. Okay, and now we have it around our image as well. Okay, so wherever we need it. So I want you to just concentrate on these types of mix-ins today. Just some rules that we can store inside of a mix-in name and call in those rules where we need them. So think of them as like reusable snippets of code. Tomorrow, we're going to learn how to make these mix-ins even more reusable. But for today, I just want you to focus on writing some basic mix-ins. Okay. All right, I'm gonna stop here. I'm gonna give you another short break to give you a chance to ask any final questions in Slido, and then we're gonna spend the rest of this guided project talking a little bit about your project for today. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back, Web31. Let's answer some questions. Can nesting help write cleaner code? Also, what are some other ways to be more optimal when coding? Yeah, great question. So nesting does help you write cleaner code in that it helps keep your code more organized. So that's what your goal is here. So you're more organized when things are nested, and your media queries are right here, so you can see like your styles at every single screen size. So it's just a way of keeping your code more organized. There's lots of ways that you can organize yourself or make things a little easier on yourself or the next developer looking at your code. Comments are definitely another way to stay more organized and write cleaner code. Mix-ins are great because now instead of writing the same 3 lines of code over and over again, you're reusing these 3 lines of code by just calling in something like a center class. Variables are another way to stay more organized and write cleaner code. So all of these are tools that are going to help you become better developers. The key to, I guess, being a good developer is organization. So planning and organization, and just remembering too that like you might come back and read this code 6 months from now, and you want to be as helpful to your future self as possible by writing some comments so that you understand what's going on and maybe why you did things a certain way. And you also want to be helpful to any team members who are going to come and read your code after you. So good question. I hope that is a sufficient answer for you, but I would just try and stay as organized as possible. That's gonna really help you in the future. Okay, let's talk about our project for today. I'm gonna scroll down here and open it up. Today we are creating a digital resume. So here's the example PNG. It's okay, but I've seen nicer resumes. So if you want to get creative today, I highly encourage you to do so. Canva, so canva.com, is a great place for resume designs. So if you go to Canva and you type in resume, and you click on resume, there's all of these cool designs that you could use as inspiration. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so say I really like this resume, then I would try to take this resume and turn it into a website. And this is where some planning has to come in. And no matter how experienced you are as a developer, it's always a good idea to plan your site before you start coding it. So I would draw this out on a piece of paper and start marking things up. So this is probably its own div. Okay, this is probably its own div. Okay, then here you might have a header inside of this div. This is probably your H1. This is probably an H2. This is probably a paragraph. These also might be in their own div to keep everything together. Then you would have, different sections. So I would really start drawing things out and marking them up before you start coding. You don't have to do this, but if you just try to look at this picture and translate it into code, you're probably going to make a lot more mistakes. So you're going to save yourself some sanity if you take the time to really mark things up first. If you prefer to just use the PNG from today's project and build off of this because you don't want to spend time looking for a resume mockup, that's totally fine too. So you can just build this today, or you can get more creative and build your own resume. That is totally your choice. Just don't spend so much time trying to get creative that you don't have time to code. So I just want to make that note. Okay, so when you land here, you're gonna go through your regular Git flow. So the first thing you're gonna do is fork. I've already forked this. Then you are going to add your TL as a collaborator. You're going to clone this down to your desktop. So I'm going to copy that. Let me open up my terminal and we can clone this down together. Okay. I'll make this a little bit bigger so everyone can see it. So pwd, cd desktop, cd lambda assignments. I already have this project. Let me just delete it so I can clone it down again. Preprocessing 1. Just get rid of that. There we go. Okay, so I want to clone it into Lambda assignments, so I'll just say git clone and then the URL. Then I want to CD into the project, so preprocessing 1. I want to create a branch, so git checkout -b. Okay, and then I can open this up and start working in it. Okay, so if I open this up in VS Code, open this up. Okay, notice that we have an index.css. It's completely empty. We've got a less folder with an index.less. That's got our reset in it. And then we've got an index.html that is blank because we are building our resume in there today. Notice that your CSS points to your index.css file. So at the end of the day, we are still loading our CSS file into the browser. We're not loading our less file. We're just working in our less file and then compiling that into CSS. Okay, so this is where our less watch compiler comes in. So the first thing I'm gonna do is type less c-v to make sure that I get a version number and that less is installed correctly, okay? So it should give you less c and then some number beside it. Okay, what is the command that I need to run to start less? Take a look in the training kit and tell me what is the command that I need to run to start less. Yeah, that less watch compiler command is what I'm looking for. So less watch compiler, less CSS index.less. Before I run that command, I just want you guys to watch, and I'm going to show you why we're running this command, okay? So I am going to type a different command. I don't want you to type this command. I just want you to watch. So I'm going to type less c less/index.less css/index.css. Okay, so here I am typing where my code is coming from and what it should be compiled into. Okay, I'm gonna show you. So inside the less file, we have our reset. Inside this index.css file, we have nothing. If I run this command and I go back and I look at my index.css, I can see that that reset has been compiled. Awesome. I'm going to go into my index.less and I'm going to write a rule because we're working now out of our index.less file. I'm going to say body background dash color pink. I'm going to save this. Notice that in my index.css, nothing has been compiled, okay? I would have to go and run this line of code every single time I made a change if it were not for less watch compiler. So now I've run that line again. Now I have background color pink. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to my index.less. I'm gonna run that less watch compiler command. So this is the command that I want you to run. It's less watch compiler, less CSS index.less, okay? So where it's coming from, where it's going to, and the file it should be watching. Okay, I'm gonna hit enter. And now it says watching directory for file changes. Okay, so now it's watching my less. So now I'm gonna change the background color. I'm in my index.less. I'm gonna change it from pink to orange. I'm gonna hit save. If I look at my terminal, notice that it's seen a change there, okay? And if I go back and I check my index.less, notice that it's automatically changed to orange. So when we run that less watch compiler command, we're saying watch my less file for changes, and every time I hit save, you're going to compile those changes into CSS. That way I don't have to run that less c less / index.less css / index.css command every single time I make a change, okay? So you're probably thinking, well, my terminal right now is being occupied. Less watch compiler is taking over my terminal, and now I can't push my code. So when you want to push your code, you can hit Control-C to stop less watch compiler from running. You can make your changes, git add period, git commit -m, git push -u origin branch name. And then once your changes have been pushed, you can run that less watch compiler command again and tell less, okay, now you need to start watching my files again, okay? Alternatively, you could open a second terminal, CD into your project, push with one terminal, and have less watching your code with another terminal. Okay, so however you want to do it. You can either use two terminals, or you can just stop less from watching your files, make your push, and then come back and tell less to start watching your files again. So either way. Another thing I want you to pay attention to here is less will catch errors for you. So for example, I'm going to put an extra closing curly bracket here. I'm going to save this. Okay, see if it's compiling. Notice that things have turned red. Okay, so there's an error here. Sometimes less will even tell you where that error is or what line to look on for the error. So it doesn't look like there's an error message here. It's not compiling into CSS. Oh, it is. It did compile that error. Maybe just one. Maybe that's not a serious enough error. Let's see. Index.css, save, index.less, let's make another closing angle bracket, save. Ah, there we go. Okay, so we can see, here's the error message here. I was coding it in the wrong file. Okay, so it's telling you that there's an error here. Killed, false, code 1, signal null. This is an error message. So pay attention to these error messages. It looks like right here, we're possibly missing an opening curly bracket, and it even tells you the line that you should look on. So around line 62. So if we go back, looks like on line 62, we've got an error. Okay, so that's another really, really cool thing about using the terminal and using less watch compiler is will call out those errors for you. So now that I've fixed that error, we can see that everything was compiled correctly and we should be good to go. So if you're getting errors in your terminal, read the error message and make sure that you're looking for those syntax errors because it will catch them for you. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to see if there's any final questions, and then I will let you go for lunch a little bit early today. So let's see. Carmen says, how could we create a div on the side? So Carmen, if you're interested in doing that resume in particular, send a message to the help channel and we can help you plan it out. But basically, you would just have two separate divs. You would give that little div that stays on the side a smaller width, let the other div take up like maybe 80% of your page, and then you could just code from there. So you would have sections probably inside of divs at that point. I would call that div that stays on the side something like sidebar, and I would give this like a width of 20%. I would give the other div, which I would call something like main content, a width of 80%, and then I would put my sections inside of there. Okay, another question here. I saw you did something like div.button-parent. Can you do something similar to this in VS Code? So I'm not really sure what you mean here. So in this case, I would just be calling a div with the class of button parent. You could definitely create a div with a class of button parent in VS Code. You could definitely call it in your less. So remember today, the things that you're focusing on are nesting inside of your less file. So you're working inside of less. So you want to focus on nesting, you want to focus on variables, and you want to focus on creating those mix-ins when you have reusable code. Variables I would probably put at the top of my file, because they're going to be consumed by the compiler, and the next developer coming to work at your, or coming to look at your code, they might want to see right away what all your variables are. So I would either put them there, I might put them after my general styles. Okay, so your reset goes first, then your general styles, then I would put things like variables and mix-ins, and then I would start writing all of my less code after that. Let's see if there's any final questions here. John says, div is not semantic. I thought we should be semantic. Yes, you should absolutely use the most semantic tag possible. In this case, though, you're doing this for stylistic purposes. So I wouldn't really call these sections, because there's sections inside of here. So these are divs. I don't think there's a more semantic thing to call them. They would just be divs. You could do two sections if you wanted to, but like this really isn't a section. You're just doing this for stylistic purposes. So that is probably why I'd call that a div. All right, if there's no final questions, looks like maybe there's one more. What was the OG channel you dropped in the compiler extension guide in? Do you mean the less documentation? I don't really know what you're talking about here, Bryce. The less documentation, you can either look it up on Google, or you can check the main Web31 channel. It is posted there. All right, I'm gonna stop here. I'll let you go take lunch a little bit early today, and then get started on your project. We'll see you this afternoon.